Okay, we are starting very soon. Okay. Cool. Okay, I think we can start really, right? Okay, so after this. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us on this particular webinar on a nice, not too hot Wednesday afternoon for those of us in Singapore. Okay, so this is the first hybrid webinar we have done where we have live people here with some live attendees behind as well. That's why it's actually on Zoom. So sorry it took a bit of a while because it is a challenge to try to do this kind of thing as well, right? We have a production crew. So right now, hope everybody can see us and all that. And what is happening is that we introduce you to the panelists. So first and foremost, we have Lisa on the other side. So that's Lisa. And I think they will introduce themselves very quickly during their sections. Then we have Nizam. Everybody to me, Nizam definitely. And of course, we have Dr. Ali, right? So he's here as well. So I think without further ado, let's give the floor to Lisa to start the section off, right? Thank you. Yep, cool.
All right. So this is the first session that we're doing that is relating to DeFi and also talking about the regulations around DeFi. So before we go into all the very deep, further academic kind of mathematical mechanisms and economic mechanisms, I think it's very important to start off this entire session with a very big overview of DeFi. So the DeFi use cases, what's the current state of DeFi, and comparing DeFi with traditional finance. So what is DeFi? DeFi is really just decentralized finance. And you know that in finance is a very broad industry. You have a lot of different sectors in traditional finance. And what DeFi is doing is trying to disrupt traditional finance in a very distributed, digital, and decentralized way. So there are not the thing about traditional finance is that it's a very big topic, right? Every time someone says, "Oh, I'm in finance," and usually the conversation just stops. Whereas if someone says, "Oh, I'm a doctor," you'd be like, "Oh, what kind of doctor are you? Are you a surgeon? Are you like a GP? Are you like a gynecologist?" Whereas if someone is in finance, usually you just end it over there. Because the thing is, finance is very complicated. It's very broad. It has a lot of different sectors. It has a lot of different scopes. So finance is complicated and difficult. And now we add on decentralized finance, which is combining finance and economics and mathematics and technology in there, it becomes a lot more confusing. And that's why, as much as I want to say that DeFi is quite easy to enter and DeFi is very, very easy to understand, there's a barrier to entry because there are a lot of information that you need to know and need to understand before you can get into DeFi. So to get you started with DeFi, I just want to start with the 9 different big sectors that you have in DeFi. So currency as a medium of exchange, the different kind of assets, where do you keep the assets, the exchanges, lending and borrowing, derivatives, funds and portfolios, insurance, and beyond finance. These are things that you have in traditional finance anyway, and I'm going to compare what is the difference between traditional finance and the use case in DeFi, as well as introduce some of the different protocols out there. So let's start with currency. Currency is the medium of exchange. You probably heard this many times that currency has a lot of different functions to define what a currency is. But we're going to go back down to the very, very core and very basic, where currency is a medium of exchange. We can exchange goods between 2 different users. So in the traditional finance world, we have a lot of the usual fiat currencies. So like GBP, USD, EUR, RMB. Today we're also looking at e-currencies. So e-money and CBDC, which is something that's quite a big topic. People are trying to figure out how that works. And at the UN, we have this organization called ITU, International Telecommunications Union. And what we're trying to do is also to understand how do we standardize global digital currencies. That's beyond just CBDC. That's also including e-currencies, e-money. And these are very interesting innovations and regulations that's out there right now, which I'm pretty sure Nizam will talk about it. So that's what we have in the traditional finance space. In the DeFi space, we have something a bit different. So other than the usual, Ethereum and Bitcoin, there are other things that we're looking at. So we have USDC, or the stable version of USD that can interact on crypto and interact with the different protocols on crypto. Then we have REP-BTC. So REP-BTC is pretty much BTC, but you know that all these different technology has different layer 1 solutions. So for example, if we have Facebook, we can open Facebook on Safari, we can open Facebook on Firefox, we can open Facebook on Chrome. And all these different browsers, web browsers, are basically your different layer 1 protocols. So you could have Bitcoin as a layer 1 protocol, you can have Polkadot as a layer 1 protocol, you can have Ethereum as a layer 1 protocol. And at the end of the day, Bitcoin is just an asset that exists on these different layer 1 protocols. And right now, we don't have the technology to interrupt between all of them, which means if I have Facebook that only interacts with Chrome, that means I can't use Facebook on Safari because we're not at the stage where all these browsers can talk to each other yet. So this is where REP-BTC comes in. It's basically Bitcoin, but Bitcoin that only exists on Bitcoin's protocol. Now we wrap it up, so we take Bitcoin and then we create a new Bitcoin called REP-Bitcoin that exists on the Ethereum layer. So it's pretty much the same thing, but you can use it on different kind of protocols, different kind of systems, which is very cool. And then you have Ethereum. Ethereum, sometimes people say this, it's not money, it's not currency, some people say it is. I would say that because right now I'm defining Bitcoin as a medium, Ethereum as a medium of exchange. And when we're talking about a medium of exchange, we're always thinking, okay, P2P, as in users to users. If I want to change money with you, then we can just change it like that. But the thing is, with Ethereum, it is still a medium of exchange, but not between peer-to-peer. It's between protocols and protocols. So if my protocol is built on Ethereum and I have a lot of data and information, I need to validate this information, which is validated on the Ethereum protocol, then I need to be paid for gas fees. I need to be paid for transaction fees. And those are being paid in Ethereum. So in that sense, Ethereum is a transaction, it's a currency, it's a medium of transactions for protocols and protocols. And lastly, we have other types of more innovative kind of currencies, for example, Ampleforth. So Ampleforth uses, instead of USDC, where they're using pegged currencies, Ampleforth uses a different kind of mechanism, very interesting math behind, but basically just functions as the same currency as a medium of exchange. So those are just currencies as an asset, currencies in general. And then now we look at assets. In traditional finance, if you know traditional finance, there are a lot of existing asset classes. Equities, bonds, properties, FX, all the different assets that exist. And these are very good because these are there in the space right now. There are a lot of regulations. The whole SEC has proper regulations around it. Today, with crypto assets, with DeFi, is something a bit new. It's something like a new asset class because it combines quite a lot of different existing asset classes together to create a new asset class, or it could be something completely new, which is very interesting. So, for example, we have DAI. DAI is quite similar to FX, so because it's a stable currency, so it's quite similar to FX. But you have all these other tokens like Compound, Aave, and YFI. These are more of a governance function, but they also allow you to get some form of cash flow that is created by the ecosystem. So it mixes quite a lot of interesting asset classes that is existing in the traditional finance world and combining them together. And that's why you can't just take any asset class, any traditional regulations in the asset class, take it out and just paste it on DeFi, because DeFi as an asset class is something quite different, something quite new, something quite unknown for this space right now. And where do you keep these assets? This is something a bit tangent of DeFi, but I think it's quite important to take note of, because in traditional finance, we have two types. We have traditional finance, traditional banks, and fintech banks, like your neobanks. So for traditional banks, you have your usual HSBC, Standard Chartered, DBS, Bank of America, and stuff like that. And then for fintech banks, you have the neobanks, you have the digital banks like Monzo, Revolut. These are getting regulated, or there are regulations in place, and this is a good step where you could move on to completely digital and decentralized, because this is from centralized, physical centralized, to digital centralized, and then you can go to digital decentralized, which is where your DeFi wallets exist. And these DeFi wallets, there are different types of DeFi wallets, and the DeFi wallets also exist depending on the different layer 1 protocols. So again, these DeFi wallets, think of them as on different browsers, and these browsers don't interact with each other yet, and that's why it's important to talk about the different DeFi wallets on the different protocols. And then right now, one of the biggest things, so those three stuff, the first three things are just very, very general introduction of how to understand DeFi, not even to get into DeFi yet, just how do you understand DeFi, how does DeFi work, and what are the tools available, the infrastructure available to be building DeFi, to be supporting DeFi. Now we're going to go a bit deeper into how do I enter DeFi, how do I get to play in DeFi, how do I get involved in DeFi. And one of the easiest way to get involved is through an exchange. Because with assets available, you get to change them to assets that can be interacting with DeFi, and exchanges are a big thing. In traditional finance, you have your usual exchanges, that's all your listed stocks, your Nasdaq, your stock exchange and stuff like that. In DeFi or in crypto, you have two types of exchanges. You have a centralized crypto exchange and a decentralized exchange. For a centralized crypto exchange, it uses the same kind of traditional finance order book system. So you have an order book, a seller is interested in something, puts the order in, a buyer sees the order and wants to buy it, and then you put it in, or the order book matches the supply and demand. So it's, you have Binance, you have for FTX. And these are things that's already in place. You're just trading. The only difference between centralized crypto exchanges and decentralized and traditional finance is that you just trade different types of assets. And now decentralized exchange is something that's very interesting because we're talking about trading, we're talking about exchange, we're talking about I have an asset and I want to change to another asset that you have. And if we don't have an order book, how do we decentralize it? So this is where the math comes in, this is where some mechanism comes in, where you have different, you're basically creating liquidity, you're basically creating market, instead of a market maker in centralized exchange, we have this thing called liquidity providers, which are decentralized market makers. So these are where tokens come in to incentivize people to become market makers in a decentralized way. It also uses a lot of interesting math and concepts to be allowing you to swap between or exchange between two different assets. The other way to get into the space is through lending and borrowing. So you put up collaterals, you get to borrow all the collaterals that you have, and then you can enter the space. So your collaterals could be something like Bitcoin, and then you can borrow against Bitcoin, or you can borrow against your Bitcoin collaterals, and then you can be trading and enter the space. So in traditional finance, you have all your traditional banks and fintech banks that does that. And in the decentralized way, you have your lending protocols. So likewise, you have your centralized lending protocols as well. And these are like Seller, these are a few other projects, and they give you a fixed interest rate because that's something that they can control. That's the part of a centralized lending protocol. With a decentralized lending protocol, everything is a bit more based on math again. That's why math is very important in this entire DeFi space. So you have stuff like RBA Maker, Compound, DYDX, and they don't calculate the interest rate based on something that they assume or they could guarantee. And the interest rate is usually based on the amount of borrowing and lending, the amount of capital, the amount of collaterals that they have in the system. And then the next thing I want to talk about is also derivatives. So derivatives is still very young and very new in the DeFi space, but derivatives is very important because if you look at traditional finance, derivatives takes up most of all the financial trade. So there's a huge market in derivatives. However, we started with exchange and lending and borrowing first because they're a bit more of the low-hanging fruit to be able to turn traditional finance into a bit more like decentralized finance. But derivatives is another big thing that's being talked about quite frequently right now. So for derivatives, the traditional finance, you have your futures, forwards, your swaps, your options, your structured notes, your different types of swaps. In DeFi, because it's still very new, we don't have all that kind of stuff. We don't have a very solid infrastructure of all these different stuff, but there are assets that you can play around that you can trade. So for synthetics, for example, you can create synthetic assets and trade on them. Option and OPYN and hedging are basically options. So not only can you borrow and trade and lend and all the traditional financial stuff, you can use options to be hedging against your exposure. So with all these derivatives in space, this is a big difference between what we have today and what we had in 2018, because now you have a lot of other tools available to be reducing your risk and to be hedging against the different kind of losses and volatility in the market. Then we have FTX and UMA. FTX is basically a decentralized exchange that FTX is basically an exchange that does derivatives. So you get to long, short, you get to leverage. And then UMA is also another type of derivatives in space. So now you could short things, now you could long things, now you could have leverage on things, which is a very different infrastructure and a very different kind of skill sets that you have in place compared to 2018. Now let's move on to the third layer, and these are things that's a bit more than just traditional lending, borrowing, trading, and just P2P activities. So funds and portfolios. In traditional finance, you have different kind of funds and portfolios, like your ETF, your mutual fund, your hedge funds, your municipal funds, all these funds available. And these are all regulated. In decentralized finance, or in DeFi, we have different types of decentralized portfolios. So for example, PyDAO and Balancer. And these are portfolios that's not owned by one person. Because in DeFi, we're talking about decentralization. So how do you have an ETF that is not only owned by a lot of different people who own it can also determine what's the percentage or weightage of assets in your ETF. So that's something that's quite interesting, and this is where the whole idea of governance token becomes a bit more important in this asset class or in this function. Then we also have insurance. Just now we talked about derivatives having options as a way to hedge, as almost like an insurance to the space. However, insurance is also quite a big market. And right now in traditional finance, you have your traditional insurance players. And in decentralized finance, other than having options as a way to hedge against your volatility and exposure of your market, you also have this company called Nexus Mutual. So they are a mutual company based in the UK, and they're regulated. So to be one of these, to hold the tokens of Nexus Mutual, you actually have to go through KYC with the UK government to become a board of director in this regulated company. And the idea of decentralized insurance is very interesting. Because if you think about insurance in DeFi, there are a lot of different types of insurance classes or type of risks. So there's three types of main risks. The first type of risk is the internal technological risk. So your smart contract has a bug, and you could underwrite that risk because the bug or the entire smart contract is open, and anyone can go in and audit. The second type of risk is external technological risk. So for example, the layer 1 of Ethereum fails, or some technological breakout and you couldn't send your data, you couldn't send your transactions. And these are things that it's a bit harder to underwrite, and right now people are figuring out how to underwrite that risk, and there's no insurance coverage for that. The third type of risk is the economic risk, because we talked about how all these DeFi, everything about DeFi is about using tokenization to align incentives between all the different players in the market and all the different agents in the market. Now, if you have these tokens, you have the power of the token can be used for voting, the token has different cash flow, and then you can add it into the token. Then this token now becomes very important and powerful, and there's some form of economics factor to it. And then there can be a lot of different risks involved in terms of how the token is designed, what kind of value is being accrued in the token. And because of that, there needs to be proper insurance to underwrite that. But because this space is still so new, we don't have any insurance underwriting that. Right now, Nexus Mutual only underwrites the first type of insurance, which is the internal risk of a smart contract. So that means if there is a bug in it, you can get an insurance, and then if there's a bug in the smart contract, you lose your funds, then you could get your funds back through the insurance policy. And lastly, beyond finance. The thing is, finance is a very complicated and big space, but finance is basically just the first start to how you enter the space, how you can do it. Finance is just a tool, a means to an end of how can we have a very collaborative Web 3.0 ecosystem. So in the traditional world, you have art and betting markets in the whole traditional finance way. And in DeFi, we're looking at this thing called NFT. NFT is basically non-fungible tokens, and each token is unique on its own. That means if I have a token that represents me and my digital identity, that's something that's unique on its own, you can't just replicate it. However, if I have a Bitcoin, then I can replicate Bitcoin, because me giving out that Bitcoin and receiving another Bitcoin back, doesn't matter what is the specific Bitcoin, it's fungible. Each Bitcoin is the same value. But if I want to tokenize my identity and have a non-fungible token to it, then you just can't replicate a different version of a female Asian person and say that, okay, this person is equivalent to my digital identity. So that's the difference. So NFT right now is booming. It boomed in late 2018, and right now it's booming again because we're interacting NFTs with DeFi. So it becomes a very interesting dynamic. And right now you have a few ways to get into DeFi. You've got Super Rare, you've got Abegoji, Rabbits, Meta Factory, Meme. these are different tools available to interact DeFi with NFTs, to be able to connect and collaborate these two different kind of users in the ecosystem together. So it's really moving and driving the mainstream adoption of DeFi and NFTs. So this is just the NFT version, and then for trading and betting markets, we have Augur and Gnosis. So in summary, these are all the 9 different kind of sectors, and comparing traditional finance and decentralized finance to give you a better understanding of the use cases in DeFi and what are the players that are in there right now. And lastly, if you want more content like that, you can go out and check the YouTube video for more educational content.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for your time. And we shall go very quickly to the next speaker, Nizam.
Thanks very much, Kevin. And hi, everyone. Good to see you virtually, and warm welcome to those of you, the few of you in the room. I'm going to talk about my favorite set of topics, which is regulations, the kind of topic that we want to hear after lunch. So we're going to try to keep it very light-hearted, and it's really to address the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is there such a thing as DeFi regulations? Does it exist? Like this. Okay, before that, just a preface, and apologies if some of you might have seen this. There are really 3 realities in life: death, taxes, and more regulations. Next slide, please. And here's another reality, that financial services is the most heavily regulated industry in the world. Next slide. And here's yet another reality, that regulations is technology agnostic. What does this mean? Now, if you listen to Lisa's very comprehensive overview about the DeFi universe, I think what struck me was that it is really an alternate universe to financial services. So you can't put DeFi in one box. So it's neither banking, it's neither insurance, it's not capital markets. It could be any one of these. And the reality is, when a regulator looks at a lot of these activities, it doesn't matter whether the activity is done through a blockchain-based platform or through a traditional brick-in-the-wall kind of business model. And this is really a snapshot of the MES temple. So this is actually taken from their own paper. This talks about their philosophy of regulation. I think what I'd like to highlight is the fact that, if you look at the apex of the temple, MES promises that it wants to create both a sound and also a progressive financial services sector. Progressive meaning that it wants to promote innovation. So that's actually a stated objective for the MES. And of course, regulation could be in the form of the different functions that the MES does, like regulation, issuing new laws, authorization where it licenses entities, supervision when they come knocking on your door and inspect you, surveillance and enforcement something that we don't want them to do. And if you look at the principles, so these are the principles that underlie the MES regulatory philosophy. And now they are really risk-focused, meaning that they are concerned about the particular risks that a set of financial services activity brings to the market and address those risks. And they're supposed to be business-friendly. So these are the MES's own words. Next, please. Okay, I thought I could debunk a couple of myths. One myth is, and having spoken to a few people who come and say, hey, Nizam, I want to do this DeFi project because don't have regulations, right? It doesn't exist. Again, I repeat, this is snake oil. This is not my corporate logo. It's not true. Right? Financial services is the most heavily regulated industry in the world. So it doesn't matter what you call it, right? You look at the underlying economics of what you're offering. Next slide, please. Myth number 2. Now, someone actually told me this. If everything is on the smart contract, you program everything, so who are they going to catch? No one to catch, right? Again, this is not true, right? I mean, smart contracts are programmed by human beings, by and large, and you set the rules, you set the algos, and that is a person who is promoting this DeFi project. There probably are corporations promoting this. There are people selling tokens. So it's not true, and I think fundamentally it is wrong to say that just because you can't identify a person or the corporation, therefore I am scot-free. So again, this is another myth that needs to be debunked. Number 3 is, it's okay if I do everything offshore, not in Singapore, so I'm all right. Again, it's not true, right? I mean, even if you set up an offshore entity that promotes a particular platform, if you are here in Singapore promoting that project, or in any other country for that matter, I think if you've done something wrong, then the laws can catch up with you fairly efficiently. And finally, the last myth. Again, it is not true that all DeFi projects are scams. I think there is real value that a good DeFi project or responsible DeFi project can bring, as Lisa has very articulately pointed out in her opening presentation. Now let's move on to some of the more serious stuff. Okay, I think when you look at a DeFi project, so I've broken it down to 2 dimensions or 2 sets of issues that you really need to look at. One on the underlying platform itself, the financial services that you are offering on the blockchain. So I think one of the key questions is asking, are the underlying economics regulated? Now it was interesting that Lisa actually presented, compared traditional finance against DeFi. And you note that she broke it down into different areas, like derivatives, exchanges, banking, insurance. And that really is the point, that if a regulator comes across a DeFi project that is fundamentally smells, let's say, like a funds project. So, there is a manager, you put, or you take in a cryptos, you pull it, there is a manager that allocates it. It doesn't matter whether it's a real manager or you do it on the algos. You invest in underlying assets and then you get the returns from it. You know what? It smells like fund management and it's likely to be regulated as fund management. So do you need a license? In most instances, if you conduct regulated activities without a license, that is a criminal offense. So again, something that needs to be taken into account. Now, the next point is very relevant, particularly for us in Singapore. So even if it's not regulated today, is it likely to be regulated soon? Now, we just had a consultation paper on the Omnibus Act, which seeks to regulate certain activities relating to cryptos, where you promote certain crypto activities out of Singapore, even if your target audience is outside of Singapore. Earlier in the year, there was another consultation paper seeking to extend the scope of services under the Payment Services Act. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. Next, what kind of compliance and risk management framework should I put in place? DeFi project is financial services, and financial services is all about risk management. Hence, compliance and risk management is key, even if you're not regulated. So these are the bunch of very high-level questions in relation to the underlying financial services that you're offering in your project. Now, in terms of the token, I think a lot of these are actually not new. So you need to ask whether the tokens are digital payment tokens, which might be governed under the Payment Services Act, and whether they're securities tokens. And this is quite a real issue for a lot of DeFi projects that seeks to, for instance, promise to pay some form of passive returns, or whether you pay a certain percentage. And it tends to make it closer to the securities line for those sort of securities. It's also relevant in projects where you pool investments or you pool various forms of cryptos, it gets channeled into underlying projects and then you pay a return. It's likely to be a securities. So again, you need to carefully analyze the structure of your project to determine whether or not this falls into securities. Because if they are securities, there are 2 broad implications. First, the offer of any securities, particularly to retail, need prospectuses, and that's a very arduous regulatory process to jump through. Second, the second implication is if you offer securities, it needs to be done by licensed intermediaries. So this is very critical. And whether they're commodities, because commodities may be regulated under the Commodities Trading Act, or their derivatives under the SFA. So again, we need to carefully analyze what exactly is the proposition. Next, even if you are offering utility tokens which are not securities, now because of the Payment Services Act, remember the PSA regulates exchanges as well as dealing in digital payment tokens. platform, for instance, if your business model that you'll be issuing digital payment tokens on a regular basis and trading it, it might require licensing. You might need to apply for a license. Alternatively, you might work with a licensed entity. Next, please. All right, here is a snapshot of some of the more recent blockchain-focused regulatory developments. Now, again, this is very specific to blockchain activities. So remember what I also said about if the underlying economic activity is, say, banking, then theoretically the Banking Act does apply. I'm not going to go through this in detail because of the shortness of time, and I think you might be familiar, or this group of people might be familiar with some of these developments. But the short message is this, that the regulators are very busy issuing out new regulations which are related to the blockchain. So again, when they look at the DeFi space, they will look at it with a lot of interest because there are all kinds of regulatory interests for the regulators to look into. I mentioned the Omnibus Act. So these actually governs activities which are done by cryptocurrency-based players in Singapore, even if they target investors or users outside of Singapore. Next, please. Now, so this actually expands on what I mentioned earlier, that the Payment Services Act will be enlarged to include additional activities. For instance, the transfer of digital payments tokens. If you look at the definition, it is potentially quite wide. Custodian wallets will be regulated soon. Brokering of DPT transactions, whether or not you actually get into possession of the tokens, or brokering of cross. So this is remittance, but brokering of the digital payment token transactions is actually very broad. So if I bring together someone who wants to sell Bitcoins, and I match him to somebody who wants to buy to swap it to any other tokens, that will be a regulated activity, and I think this could impact a lot of DeFi projects as well. Okay, so these are some of the AML and CFT issues. Now, when you look at a lot of the pronouncements made by the Financial Action Task Force, which is an international body that sets standards for money laundering worldwide, and if you study a lot of the statements made by the MES, the key risk front and center of crypto transactions is money laundering and terrorist financing, because of the speed at which transactions can take place, and you can move assets worldwide, within a few seconds. So these are just some of the high-level issues that you need to think about if you're looking at a DeFi project. So AML, I suggest, is front and center, even if you're not, conducting a regulated activity, because money laundering laws are there. So if hypothetically, even if you're not regulated, and you facilitate an exchange of assets, and the person who does that exchange happens to be a criminal or a terrorist, you are liable. So typically, when you look at money laundering framework, you'll be looking at things like identity verification. So even when you sell tokens, so the MES has made it clear that even when you issue digital payment tokens, you must do AML checks. So identity verification, you need to know that if I say I'm Nizam Ismail, you must ascertain that it is me who is actually, signing up to your platform. Screening of names against databases, looking out for things like previous criminal conduct, sanctions lists, politically exposed persons, all the higher risk indicators. So these are pretty standard requirements. You must risk assess your customers, conduct enhanced due diligence for higher risk customers, enterprise-wide risk assessment, transaction monitoring, refresh your customers. So all these obligations are pretty standard obligations, but I suggest that if you're looking at a DeFi project, this should be your #1 priority. Next, please. Again, technology risk management is front and center as well, especially for regulated payments entities. And these are some of the issues that you want to look at when it comes to technology risk management. Again, I don't propose to go through this. That's a new body in itself, an entire new body in itself. Next. Okay, now turning to the regulators. If I'm a regulator, following this event, how should I think about managing or regulating DeFi. So this is Ravi Menon during the FinTech Festival, and he was addressing the whole issue, how you manage the tension between regulations and innovation. The critique is that typically regulations fall behind innovation, and rightly so, because you don't want to front run. So you can't front run innovation because you end up killing innovation. So that he stated this is his own words. And his proposition is that the regulator must run alongside innovation. You must take note of what's going on. But he mentioned that there has to be a sense of materiality before the regulator steps in. That I only want to regulate when something becomes so material. And when I do regulate, I have to do it proportionately. It has to be proportionate regulations. And it has to be risk-focused. Again, echoing the words in the MES temple earlier on that we saw. And this was the own words. You must let 1,000 flowers bloom, but it has to be a nice garden. And that's a very important caveat. You just can't let it grow until it becomes a horrible mess. So this is the stated objective. Yes. And then he also talked about like sandboxes as a way to enable experiments. So if you are licensed, but you're not very sure what kind of licenses you might need, or you do something that's really innovative and you want to be able to try it, even if you're not yet ready for a license. So they've created a sandbox to allow you to test your platform. So I think the sandbox will become quite relevant. If you're a serious DeFi promoter and you're thinking of something and it could be regulated. And in truth, there could be lots of gray areas because some of the regulations may or may not apply to cryptos. So let's take banking, for instance. And again, this is a gray area because technically a deposit is where you put actual fiat money with an entity. The entity safekeeps it and promises to return the principal amount that you place with it, plus some interest. That's a deposit. I'm just simplifying things. However, it's not clear whether it applies to a crypto transaction. If I place BTC with someone and the person pays the return, is it a deposit? Again, it's not entirely clear. Or if I lend cryptocurrencies, is that lending? Again, the regulations typically talk about fiat. It might not be clear whether cryptocurrencies fall in the lending regulations. So in those sort of instances, I think it might not be a bad idea to actually have a very open conversation with the regulators. And then if you think that you might need a license, the sandbox is an option for you to think about. So again, get good advice and be open about your business model. Okay, here are some regulatory considerations if I'm a regulator, things I need to think about. Now, typically regulators like to regulate entities or human beings, right? But in the case of a DeFi platform, I might not have offices, I might not have physical premises, there might not be warm bodies because a lot of things is automated. And that's the whole idea because I am disrupting financial services and I don't want to hire an army of people to deliver services because I can automate a lot of these. So again, there might be a recalibration about how regulators look at who they are regulating. So that's one point. Next, the issue of, again, traditional regulations require that before you apply for a license, you must have a track record, either at the corporate level, or your promoters or your shareholders, or your stellar C-suite team has got all the track record. And they must be fit and proper persons. Again, some of these things might not be entirely applicable in a DeFi project. Again, this is something that needs to be rethought. Next, the cross-border nature of projects. And this is the holy grail. Now, right now, those of you who have thought about applying for licenses, if you are thinking of doing your business in 10 different jurisdictions in Asia, you will need to apply for 10 separate licenses with 10 regulators. That is a harsh reality. So unless people rely on reverse solicitation or reverse marketing to expand. But I think the broader point is there has to be some effort by regulators to look at either passporting regime like they have in the EU, where if you're licensed in one entity, you can offer services elsewhere, or a mutual recognition regime, where let's say if you're licensed in Singapore, maybe the Thai regulators could recognize the fact that you're licensed here and therefore accept you to do business in Thailand. Or the harmonization of rules. Maybe within ASEAN, there should be some harmonization of rules to avoid these multiple license applications. So that could help. So there is need for international standards. Again, there are some standard setting bodies for banking, insurance, and securities. Maybe they need to talk more actively about DeFi projects. There should be more focus on algo regulations on governance, because a lot of delivery of financial services is done through this. So I think that there is some attempt in regulations to require a governance framework for algorithms. But the difficulty for this is sometimes, I know that some regulators actually want to approve the algos, but the question is, do they really want to do that? Because you might end up stifling innovation. Sorry if you can't see the last sentence, but I think there should be more focus on disclosures, conflicts of interest. So I've spoken to some people that want to do DeFi projects, and they say, okay, if you put money in here, you'll get X% returns. Then I said, show me the documentation where you promised that. There is no documentation. People just put money in, and the algos, like a magic wand, determine the returns. You can't do that, right? I mean, would you want to put money if you don't know how much returns you're going to get? So the issues of disclosures become important because it's no different from conventional financial services. And of course, conflicts of interest as well, where you want to allocate, let's say, the cryptos that you collect for your own projects. It's a clear conflict of interest. So those sort of issues need to be put front and center. On the other hand, some of the issues that will still remain things like AML, CFT, we spoke about that in technology risk management. Customer protection is still relevant and probably more relevant because how you custodize, if you're holding lots of cryptos in a fund-like structure, and this could be very significant. BTC prices are quite significant today. So this would be something to think about. And that's the end of it. So thanks very much. I think we're going to have a Q&A later, so I'll hand you over to back to Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Nizam, for the session. So I think the last speaker for the day, before we start the panel, will be Dr. Lee.
Hello, I am Ernie. So I represent the Blockchain Association of Singapore here today. I'm the vice chair for the association. So today I'm just going to bring to you my point of view about DeFi and actually what to consider if you're considering, investing in DeFi or doing things in DeFi and trying to make money out of it. Right. So myself, I come from a enterprise blockchain background, so I don't really deal with a lot of cryptos. But I'm kind of aware of the crypto space. But when did I really took notice of DeFi was during the whole circuit breaker period, where the gas price of Ethereum shot up like crazy, right? Because I was doing a lot of Ethereum-based projects, and I had to start paying a lot of gas. What usually cost me 10 cents is now costing me $10 to do on the Ethereum blockchain. So that got my notice, and I started to look at, what is this DeFi thing that is going on, and why are so many people, exchanging tokens on the Ethereum blockchain network based on DeFi, right? So I guess it could be also the COVID effect because everyone's stuck at home and they're looking at things to invest in, but it's also something new and some kind of financial innovation that's coming out and that got a lot of attention. Right, so if we take the term decentralized finance, actually it applies to everything, even Bitcoin, Ethereum, Ether, they're all part of decentralized finance. If we want to talk about really being able to do financial functions like borrowing and lending, that comes with Bitcoin or Ether. It's very hard to do that because Bitcoin and Ether is very volatile. Everyone wants to hoard these currencies, right? Because I want to hoard my Bitcoin. I don't want to spend it now because I know 1 year later it may be double the price. Right? So no one actually wants to spend it, and therefore no one wants to lend it out or borrow Bitcoin even. Because if I borrow 1 Bitcoin now, which can get me say $1,000 US, next year it's worth $2,000 US, and I have to find $2,000 US to be paid instead. Right? So One of the first innovations that then came out of the DeFi space are stablecoins. Right? So, and that one of the most well-known is MakerDAO. So DAO is the stablecoin. So DAI is the stablecoin, sorry, DAI. So DAI is the stablecoin here. And what's the function of the stablecoin here is to facilitate financial transactions, right? So the idea is to collateralize your crypto assets and then be able to get DAI out of it, which is a stablecoin pegged to the US dollar, to allow you to transact, to allow you to do financial functions. At first, when I was told about MakerDAO, I was a bit confused. I was thinking, why would I put my Bitcoins or Ether with Maker and pay them interest, right, and get DAI out of it and to get a stable coin that I may not be able to use. Right, so then I realized that there is kind of a function behind it, because if you're holding Ether or Bitcoin, you want to hold it, right? You don't want to spend it today, but you may need cash flow. Right, so if all my assets or a large part of my assets are in Ethereum, I will need cash flow. So I can use MakerDAO to convert this amount of cryptocurrencies into DAI. Right, and DAI, because it's a stable coin, I can spend it in the ecosystem. I can use it to do various different functions. And that allows me some liquidity in terms of my crypto assets. But at the same time, I still have my Bitcoin or my Ether assets locked up in the MakerDAO contracts. And that will allow me to still have that 1 year later if I wish to cash out at that point of time. Right, so, but the whole idea of stablecoins started to facilitate more DeFi functions, and the next wave that came about, which was quite a big wave, was Compound, which was a lending and borrowing function. Right, so Compound, so again, the idea of lending and borrowing here is so different from traditional bank lending and borrowing. I was again very confused when I first started looking at it. Because you're not kind of borrowing dollars from a bank and agreeing to pay back interest. In fact, most borrowing on the DeFi platform requires collateralization. So you need to take a crypto asset and put it with the contract such that you can borrow out of it another crypto asset, which may be a stable asset. So Compound does this. Right, so to start with Compound, you always have to start with collateralization. So if you own Ether or you own Bitcoin or wrap Bitcoin, as Lisa mentioned earlier, you can collateralize it with Compound. Okay, so let's say I put in $1,000 worth of Ether and I put it into Compound. If I do nothing with it, then I become a liquidity provider. Also, again, as mentioned by Lisa. So I become a liquidity provider. Compound will start paying me Compound tokens. Right, you'll start paying me Compound tokens, which is a governance token. So I'll get to the topic of governance token a bit later. So, and then I will be earning some interest. It's like a savings account. I'm depositing my Ether with Compound and getting interest on. Now, once I have collateralized some cryptos with Compound, I can start to borrow against it. Right, so I can borrow against it to extract. So, for example, I can extract DAI out of Compound. Right, so I can tell the Compound contract, I have 1,000 Ether, I need some DAI, I want to get like $500 worth of DAI. And they will give me $1,000, $500 worth of DAI as a loan, right? And then I will be able to use this DAI as a payment token and do whatever I want to do with it as well. Right, so borrowing here comes with collateralization. So you can't just borrow straight up. So that's another complexity about lending and borrowing. Right, so basically, what do people do in this kind of scenarios? They go, which is the topic of this slide here. They do what's known as yield farming or liquidity mining. So these two things mean the same thing, which is actually putting money into a liquidity pool, right, and getting interest out of it. But you can also exchange or swap what you have collateralized into another token. Okay, so for example, I put my Ether into Compound, I take out DAI. I can go to another liquidity pool and put in my DAI, right? And then this liquidity pool again will give me interest. So I'm now earning interest on both pools. And I can again do another swap. I can swap my DAI into something else. So Compound has something called CDAI, which is a representation of DAI issued by Compound. and I can take my C9 and go to another pool again and get more interest out of it. So that's what's known as liquidity farming, yield farming or liquidity mining. So like Lisa mentioned earlier, interest rates within compound is market driven. So it depends on demand and supply. So the interest keeps changing, and therefore you must be very strategic when it comes to yield farming. You need to observe how the interest rates are changing, and you need to keep swapping pools and shifting your assets around. So it's actually quite a skill to make money out of yield farming. I do not have that skill, so don't ask me for any advice in terms of how to do this. And it's fairly complex, right? So the other thing that came about shortly after Compound became, start to clog up the whole Ethereum ecosystem is the decentralized exchanges coming in as well to start their own liquidity pools. Now, why would the decentralized exchange want to have a liquidity pool? Because in decentralized exchanges, there's no assets that are held by the exchange. So in a centralized exchange, the exchange will have a float. They will have all sorts of different tokens which can serve the needs of their customers. In a decentralized exchange, it really depends on demand and supply again. Someone requesting to swap a token means another person wanting to swap the other way around. Right? So the one of the most famous decentralized exchanges, Uniswap, started to have liquidity pools as well. Right? Which means I want to have more Ether in my ecosystem so that people can swap it whenever they need to. So I attract people to come and deposit their Ether with my exchange so that I have this liquidity and I pay them interest. So SushiSwap is a fork of Uniswap, and they are the ones who kind of drove up the whole ecosystem because SushiSwap wanted to steal the liquidity from Uniswap. So they offered like horrendously high exchange interest rates. One term that was used for them was vampire mining. So they were like trying to suck up all the liquidity from Uniswap. And that really drove the whole ecosystem because people were saying, if you have $1,000 worth of Ether, you can earn like 10% interest, 20% interest at SushiSwap. So people started taking their assets, putting it in SushiSwap. And Sushi was also the first one to issue, decentralized exchange to issue governance token. So now let's get to the topic of governance tokens. So governance tokens are basically tokens that allow you to vote on how an exchange or how a lender borrower gets to act. So it's a very weird thing. So it actually has no value in itself, right? If the ecosystem has no value, right? But then there is a lot of perceived value, right? So similar to the ICO craze, where people had a lot of perceived value on the projects, there was a lot of perceived value on these governance tokens because people were thinking that, hey, I'm going to go on these decentralized exchanges are going to be big. If I own one of these governance tokens, I can vote on how this exchange evolves or what kind of tokens they accept, and it's going to be very valuable. And therefore, these companies like Uniswap, SushiSwap, Compound, they can give out governance tokens as interest virtually for free. Right? There's no cost to them to give out these tokens, right? And yet the receivers of this interest perceive value in them and are willing to take them as interest for collateralizing their assets. So it is a kind of a wild west world right now in terms of DeFi, and these are the kind of hot trends that are happening now. It is very interesting, but you need to have a lot of knowledge about it to do about it. So if you are interested in yield farming pools and so on, you can visit CoinGecko. CoinGecko has a very comprehensive list of all the farming pools out there. These are the top 5 farming pools. You can scan this QR code to go to their website, look at the pools. I think there are about 300 different pools available right now for you to collateralize your assets at an interest. Okay, so I think something is missing. But anyway, the last slide is meant to tell you what are the risks involved. So if you are thinking of going to do this, what Nizam and Lisa both mentioned, there's definitely a tech risk, which is the smart contracts. But when you're doing yield farming, another important risk to think about is the volatility risk. Right? Because Ether, your basic crypto assets, Ether, Bitcoins are highly volatile. While they are collateralized within these pools, you are also facing risk in terms of the volatility. Right? If it drops dramatically, you have to top up your collateralization. If it goes up very high, you may need to think about having to withdraw it. Right? And you also need to think about another big risk associated with pools are pool runs. So they are similar to bank runs. Right? So if a lot of the money suddenly leaves the pool, then the interest may change dramatically as well, and you may be affected if you are one of the investors. So those are things that you need to think about. I definitely suggest you look more into it before you consider doing this. You also need a lot of crypto assets in order to do this. So it's not really that inclusive in terms of participation. So really do consider the risk. I think we can now take Q&A as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you for your session. So we shall start the panel very quickly. So once the panelists get seated. Okay. So I think one of the first questions, and I think Nizam has talked about the regulators and regulations just now. So I think on everyone's mind is that how do regulators actually deal with DeFi, right? Knowing that DeFi is about anonymity with no KYC and so forth monitoring from AML, because from wallet to wallet, you can't really see who's that, right? Compared to traditional crypto transactions, where now the exchanges they have to know who you are, know who you're transacting with, etc. So how do you think regulators will deal with it? As in particular, because I think we see this projects, right? DeFi projects that they claim they are regulated, they claim that they actually follow certain licensing in certain countries without mentioning where. So how do you think there are there segments of truth in this? How will regulators do this?
Okay, that's a great question. I think at the end of the day, when it comes to AML and CFT, for any blockchain-based project, it will become non-negotiable. Why do I say this? The Financial Action Task Force has set up a set of expectations for virtual asset service providers, or VASPs. And in that set of expectations, the FATF has mentioned very clearly that it expects a virtual asset service provider, and that's defined extremely broadly to include some of the new activities that I spoke about in my presentation. So even the brokering of digital payment tokens will be caught, with somebody intimately, somebody advises on cryptos. So long as you are a service provider relating to virtual assets, you need to have robust AML and CFT in place. So even for decentralized exchanges, the regulatory position, at least in Singapore, is that decentralized exchanges are exchanges, and they all need to be regulated under the Payment Services Act. And within the ambit of the Payment Services Act, we know that the MES has stressed this very, very strongly, that AML and CFT is front and center. In fact, I always joke that the crypto guys have got it special because they've got one entire AML CFT notice in PSN02 just for them. So they're entirely special. And within that notice, which is unique for crypto players, there are additional requirements like the travel rules. There's lots of discussions right now about complying with travel rule. The expectations, the industry practice has evolved that any crypto players have to screen wallets. And there are a lot of service providers in the space right now. Not a lot, but that has become the practice where you have to screen wallets to make sure you don't bring along AML and CFT risks. So if, as I mentioned, custodial wallets will be regulated very soon. So I think it's just a matter of time that this is being enforced. So my advice again is, if you're looking at a DeFi project, AML and CFT should be your #1 priority.
Thank you. Any of the others want to comment extra? Okay. Next one, I think, will be more like, there are lot of these DeFi exchanges, I mean, the key special factor about all these decentralized exchanges like this one is that they use something called the automated market maker, right? The AMM, right? To maintain prices of tokens, adjust supply and demand, things like that. So the thing is that it is, after all, talking about manipulation of price to a certain extent. Obviously, most regulators actually frown on that, right? So how can this be actually addressed by DeFi to answer potential regulators who actually have concerns on the AMM?
I don't have answers to the regulators' perspective, but AMMs are not exactly something called market manipulation or value manipulation, because AMMs are basically, think of it as there's a cookie jar. There are cookie jars and there are two cookies in there, chocolate chip cookies and regular cookies. So how AMM works is that we have a cookie jar, and as market makers or liquidity providers, we put in the same amount of cookies into the cookie jar. So this cookie jar is basically the pool available for you to trade one chocolate chip cookie for one normal cookie, and it just exists to allow for trade. That alone is not exactly market manipulation, because you are using very specific kind of math and formulas and algorithms to calculate the price of each cookie when you exchange cookies for cookies. Now it only comes in, I guess regulation comes in when you have this tertiary party or secondary party of arbitrage traders who come in, and what they actually play a very important role, because they look at the price difference between the price of cookies in your cookie jar versus the price of cookies on Binance. And when there's a difference, they make a trade to arbitrage the difference. And that's all good. And that's in general, in the perfect world, is how it works. Everyone is happy and everyone gets to trade, and then the traders also get to earn the arbitrage difference. So that's good. The tricky part is how do you quantify front running and back running? So I was reading a paper recently that looks at how because all these are high frequency traders. So you're using very specific kind of bots or algos to be doing all these very high frequency trades. And what happens when all these math is out there, and then you've got very, very smart people who figure out how can I front run the trade. So if there's a big amount of trade being traded into the cookie jar, a big amount of chocolate chips going in, then how can I, as a trader, know everything's transparent and how I know that that's going to happen? And I can pay more gas fees to be doing the trade before this big chocolate chip cookie goes into the cookie jar, and then I can do another trade right after this big cookie transaction happens. So this is where regulators come in. Regulators will come in that aspect of how do people exploit the system, not in the way where regulators come in to see, oh, this AMM is good, this AMM is not good. There is no such thing as a good or bad AMM. You have an AMM that's more risky, less risky in terms of the kind of losses that they're trying to hedge in their math formulas. But the real regulation doesn't look at the protocol itself, but look at the traders that try to exploit the protocols. What else?
I think that that's an interesting point. If you take an analogy in the securities world, which is very well established, and securities regulation was drafted in the US since 1933, that's a very different world then. But over the decades, there have been very clear rules about what is permissible and what is impermissible conduct within the securities realm. Front running is one that's prohibited. Insider trading, market breaking, market manipulation, dissemination of false or misleading information, insufficient disclosures. Now, a lot of these actually have parallels in the DeFi world, because some of these conduct might not be fair, and there might be an level playing field, and you should actually take a view about this. Unfortunately, there is a gap in regulations. In most jurisdictions, they haven't really set out what is permissible or impermissible conduct when it comes to digital payment tokens or other tokens. And I think there's a gap that needs to be addressed. And we often hear a lot about complaints of manipulative behaviors in certain exchanges. I don't know how much of that is true, but when the Office of the Attorney General of New York did a review of micro exchanges based in the US, they found that manipulation was one key issue. But this was several years ago, and until today, I don't think much has been done, because you can't rely on securities laws. These are not securities. So there could be a regulatory gap that needs to be addressed.
Okay. Dr. Lee, do you want to?
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess it's a matter of how you choose to program your AMMs, right? And then whether there are any rules, checks and balances in place. Like stocks exchanges have checks and balances in place, right? And it's rather whether regulation wants to come in to say that these AMMs must be coded in this way to include these checks and balances. If not, it is still out there for people to exploit, and they're not doing anything wrong in a way because the system allows them to do so, right? So it's really a big question about that. And in terms of the manipulation, I think the cryptocurrency world is unequal in a way. There's a lot of the early players do own a lot of crypto assets, and because they do own that much crypto assets, they have the ability to manipulate the market as well. So it's the nature of the system, right? And unless there are checks and balances in place again for those, then it's still going to continue to happen.
Okay, thank you very much. And so one question is actually about, I think you talk about risks and all the kind of dangers and all that. So what are the risks that you actually potentially think that associate with hacks and smart contracts failures? I think that's a very common recurring topic about some smart contracts are not written well, especially that some projects are purely cut and paste, right? So whatever works in Uniswap, people just cut and paste, and that comes with cutting and pasting the witnesses and the posts as well. So what are the risks of that? And as well as like what potential other risks? I think we addressed that in the session about that. Investors and participants actually have to look into.
I think as an investor, so slightly different from what Nizam was addressing earlier, which are the issuers or the operators of DeFi. As an investor, you really have to consider that there are still going to be a lot of, because it's a very new market, right? And you need to understand the market in order to kind of manage the risk on your own, right? So if you just go into it blindly, it could be weird things that happen that you don't anticipate, right? In terms of smart contract hacks, you need to buy insurance for that. In terms of not understanding the asset well enough to understand its volatility, the way that it behaves. If you don't understand the market well or the asset well, then this currency may be waiting to have a crash, but you don't know it and you went into it, and that could be a potential big risk as well. But in terms of regulation, actually, I want to ask Nizam this question, right? As an investor, other than keeping to all the KYC rules and making sure that I pass all of them, what are the other kind of regulatory things that I need to look out for as an investor?
Okay. There is some of the general law principles that still would apply. For instance, if there's a fraudulent scheme, then you have remedies in civil law. You can sue the whoever promotes the platform, but that brings into play, who are you? What is the legal entity or the human beings that actually promote the platform? Again, if a platform is offering financial services, but which is unlicensed, so as an investor, you can question whether or not the whole offering is in fact a legal offering, because there is a general principle that if something is an illegal, the entire transaction is illegal, then it could be fraud. So those are some of the things that you need to think about. Again, as an investor, it's about asking very basic questions. Right? I mean, who are you dealing with? What exactly is the promise written? Is there a document that says that this is in fact the expectation? And who are you contracting with? Which entity are you contracting with? Particularly if you're going to put in very substantial amount of assets. These are very hard questions to ask. How are the assets being protected? Especially when you put lots of assets with you.
We talk a lot about fungible tokens and cryptocurrency tokens, but there are a different subset of tokens called non-fungible tokens. And I think this is where regulation becomes a bit more tangible, because we look at what are the different things that we can turn a physical asset into a non-fungible token. So let's say property. So we can have property, and then we can take every square meter of the property and turn it into a non-fungible token. Or we can have tokenize intellectual property rights. And in that sense, how does regulation come into play? Because when I talk about the risk, the answer to the question was about risk. So when we talk about risk, you can look at the traditional kind of regulations in place, but do they apply to these non-fungible tokens?
To some extent, they're not new because even, let's say, within commodities, there are all kinds of intangible commodities like carbon credits. You can't see it, weather, trade. So regulators or even derivatives, you can't see the product. But yes, there are rules in place for that. They recognize the value that these instruments can bring, even if they're intangible or, I suppose, non-fungible.
Right. And I think very much following up on the same train of thought, right? So regarding fungible tokens and of course governance and all that. So I think recently Hester Pierce, right, just very recently, I think 1 2 weeks, in particular event mentioned that governance tokens could be viewed by her colleagues in SEC as securities, right? And probably this kind of view is probably going to be shared by other regulators as well. So how can this potentially be addressed? Because I think once you go into the securities and futures sector, multiple jurisdictions, you will just probably kill off the project anyway. So in this case, how can you?
First off, I don't think you can, with a very broad brush, say that all governance tokens are securities. It could be a security, of course, and that depends on how it's structured. The other thing worth noting is that securities laws differ, and they're broadly similar, but there are different nuances in a lot of jurisdictions. Particularly in the US, for instance, they may have little nuances that make it different. So for instance, something that has an investment value is likely to be deemed as securities in the US, but in Singapore that is not the case. I think the MAS has made it clear. I mean, the pronouncements that it's not the MAS interest to regulate everything that's got an investment element. Otherwise, they have to regulate things like art pieces, vintage guitars, sports cars. So I think that's a sensible thing. Now, fundamentally, when it comes to whatever you call it, a governance token, an access token, or utility token, you have to look at the underlying economics and look at the statutory definitions of securities in the jurisdiction that you're in. So I think the MAS actually, in one of the interviews a couple of years ago, stated that whatever's in the US may not be the case in Singapore. So one example is, whether the platform is in fact, if you sell a utility token, if the platform is not really, it's likely to be securities in the US, but that's not the case in Singapore. So we have to be careful about different statutory or regulatory interpretations of securities.
This is quite interesting, very interesting dynamics, because I think you come from the regulation side and I come from the design side. So design and defining how these systems, how these tokens accrue value, what's the economics of this, underlying economics of this stuff. Then in between us is the different protocols that will translate whatever that we say into something that's more tangible and product-wise. And as I was mentioning the slides, there's a new asset class that's coming out, which is the crypto asset class. And it really depends on the different types of underlying economics that goes into the design of these tokens, because these tokens could be very much like a shareholder that has voting rights and rights to be making some different changes in the ecosystem, and that could be something like an equity. However, if you're talking about this token has a way to be earning some form of transaction fees, like we have a Uniswap, because based on the amount of transactions and all that kind of stuff, they could have a very different function. At the same time, it's not always just one function. It could have a mix of 3 different functions of 3 different asset classes, a subset function of these asset classes, coming together, jumble them up, and creating this new token. It could be a governance token, or it could be some crypto form of token. So these are right. You can't just put a blanket statement saying that all these governance tokens are securities. It really depends on the underlying economics and the design concept that goes into defining what this token is, where the value comes from, what is the economic value that it brings, and what are the things that goes underneath these tokens.
Okay, I think that answers the question. I think that there is a question from the audience. I think this regarding to the smart contract integrity. I think we talked about that, what the rules and all that, some smart contract having loopholes and all that. So the question is that wouldn't having a smart contract audit as well as like buying insurance be able to address that? So I think that's really the question. Maybe Dr. Lee.
So I think, yeah, smart contract audits are definitely becoming the mainstream requirement for companies that want to be like legit, and DeFi projects that want to be legit. So, but then the thing is, we don't know what we don't know. So the smart contract audits can only audit what the existing loopholes that they are aware of, right? And it's very hard because, like what Lisa mentioned, a lot of it is economics design as well. Right, so the smart contract, although it's code, there's a lot of algorithms within that based on economics. Right, so and we would not be able to know how human beings can manipulate this contract. Right, and therefore, even if you can audit the contract, you can do a lot of different test scenarios. There could still be anomalies that happen, and the contract could be manipulated, and someone could siphon out funds. So basically, yes, smart contract audits should become mainstream, and everyone should have to go through at least the minimum checks. Buying insurance does protect you in a way, but of course you have to pay for that as well. And the risks associated with this are still relatively high, so the costs are still relatively high as well.
Okay. I think that's all we have for today in terms of time as well as also, I think thank you very much to the panel for such an excellent explanation of this. I think this, to the audience, this is the first in the series. Apologies for any technical difficulties because this is the first time we're actually doing a hybrid session. I think everyone is used to Zoom at home, sitting there and just getting on with things. But for us, we have to set this up and test it. It's one of the very few ones that you see that's actually done out in this professional studio, but in ETR, right? So there will be another series of related, from BAS on DeFi and all that. Watch for it. We'll be sending out notices very soon, so we'll do deeper dive into regulations, into economic design, into the smart contracts, things like that. So watch for that. We'll show that. Now, before I end it off, at the back of it, you can see the picture behind the panelists showing about Switch 2020. We have to show this because BAS, we are an official partner of this Singapore FinTech Festival BAS in the Switch event as well. So this is happening in December, right? Take note of that. I think it's Google that. Look for tickets. I think there should be some discounts coming out soon. If we have, BAS will be first to share with you, so you can get discounted tickets to this particular event. I think thank you very much everyone for your time today. For those who are actually here on site, right, in the hybrid scenario as well as those at home watching us. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Watch for the next series. Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Bye.